A reading from Stadius and Saint La Morte, a poetic comedy by Caleb W.H. Yours truly. All of my works are in the public domain. Feel free to not only remix and remake these works, but also expound on the ideas you find within. After all, theological knowledge should of course be free. Without further ado, here is a reading from Stadius and Saint La Morte, a poetic comedy. Here we go. Act 1, The Poet and the Curse. Scene 1, Over the Garden Wall. Stadius stood wrapped in midnight. The sun was just beginning to meet the horizon in a passionate kiss. He stood on the edge of the court of the Sun King. Some nights he could hear wailing and blood-curdling screams. So he figured the hell of Louis's feast with its bacchanalia and laughter was at least more pleasant than hearing the shrieks and trills of wars of creed. He had just published 2 works, and had gained a spot here in the court of King Louis. He was a passionate man, stocky, but not necessarily rotund. And yet, as he looked into the throne room, unspeakable acts of depravity were being beheld. Louis placed a hand on one of his concubines' breasts. The other wrapped her hands around him, vying for power. The other nobles laughed and chided. It was Bacchus before he was captured. It was the feast of Dionysus. It was an inversion of everything this poet loved. Certainly not some Latin liturgy or the Byzantine rite. Rather, it was as if John Milton's Satan had ascended to his heights in France. There was nothing in Stadius's eyes as he looked into hell, which was the throne room, but pure and utter sighing. A passionate and lonely man he was, always writing of the love of God and sublime moments of grandeur, longing for an ounce of cruciform love to show to the world. However, this night he stood looking into Bacchus's hell, not necessarily mortified, but in pure lament. "Your brutishness is suffocating," he mumbled under his breath as he peered into hell. It was the palace of pandemonium, an absolute divine right, an irony of ironies. As he looked at the feast, at the laughing and dancing, he began to long for something better. He had always been aware of Michelangelo's Veiled Virgin, the statues and icons of the Theotokos, stories of Virgil and the Aeneid, Aeneas and Dido, Romeo and Juliet. It was as if all these stories were being suffocated, beaten, and crucified in front of him. "Oh, how I long for this king to meet his end," Stadius uttered merely in his head. The king looked at him and smiled, beckoning him closer. Indeed, the Sun King who had taken on Bacchus's form summoned him to join in the hell. But Stadius politely declined, ushering himself out. It was putrid. Utter depravity and anger sunk over his sullen face. He decided to take his journal and walk, filling its pages with poems of long-forgotten memories, sublime ordinances he had seen in the world, divine liturgies he had been a part of. All had been caked in ink in his journal. He ushered himself out into the hall and walked to his corridor, shuffling through his drawer. Among the rags, he found trinkets, lockets, and manuscripts of old, and finally, he found that journal. He was only about halfway through. "Perfect," he said, and he walked out of the Palace of Versailles to record agents of life among the streets of France. As he walked outside, the moon caressed his face in pure sublimity. It seemed to glisten on the water. The cold air was like the touch of a maiden long written about in Dante's Paradiso. This was his purgation and his heaven at the same time. By chance, by fate, and perhaps by providence, he decided to take a different route. There was a certain road he had never seen, one he had been too afraid to go down. Towards the basin of the river lay a small walking path, and a catacomb which no man was allowed to enter. King Louis never left it guarded. However, it was said that if one was found even remotely stepping their foot inside, they would be executed. Supposedly, it housed relics of the church and its treasures. But little did he know, he would find a treasure of far more scandal and far more beauty. Among the walkways and the catacombs, as the night began to sing, he walked by the basin of the river, a delta off the Seine. As he walked, he took notes of the little bugs crawling on the ground, the moon as it reflected in the water, and the cold air caressing his face in a passionate communion. He turned a corner and saw a famous walkway and the catacombs stretching to the left. on the basin of a wall filled with grime and dust. As Stadius walked, he looked into the river and saw not a soul, not a single soul. He walked all the way until the river met a tunnel, and then the walkway ended. When he turned around, the sublimity of the ages would come to meet him. Walking out of the catacombs 40 meters ahead was a maid wrapped in the hush of rags. Her hair glistening in the moonlight, particles seemed to radiate off of her, as if the moon wrapped her in a blanket of velvet. She stood staring up at the moon, a laurel wreath in her hair, wilted flowers hanging from it. Stadius stood, his mouth agape, as she slowly began to dance. This dance could hardly be described, perhaps as if a slight swaying. She whistled into the moonlight the only song she even knew, the only song she'd ever heard, from the caravan above her at night, playing on the road above. Stadius looked. For the first time, he entered a paradise, far exceeding Dante's. It was as if time seemed to dilate in her presence. He nearly dropped his journal, but began furiously scribbling. As soon as his own consciousness returned back to him, if there were cosmic words to describe this moment, it would be an entire treatise. When he looked up from his pages, the woman was staring at him, reserved yet scared. She relented into her usual guarded ways, placing her hands into her pockets, hastily sewn into the lace dress. Their eyes met, and Stadius opened his mouth to speak. "Mine eyes have been caressed," the poet said whimsically, almost as if in a dull trance. The woman, still reserved and recoiling slightly, snickered and asked, "I beg your pardon, sir. What is such a clandestine beauty doing out here?" The woman, now aware that she had entranced the poet, recoiled at such a thought. "Do not come near me, my friend. My beauty kills." The poet, innocently, thinking she was merely jesting at her own expense, took a step forward. But she looked so holy, he could not even bring his hand up to grace her face. She took a step back. "I am serious. Do not come near me." Stadius did as she asked, for he knew that her beauty was far too much a satisfaction. Yet he still smiled and asked her name for a second time. "Son Morte," she replied, looking into the eyes of the moon. "I am sick," she said, slowly, hesitantly. "I would not want you to catch the disease I hold." "No matter," Stadius said. "Why have you graced the river with your beauty?" The woman blushed slightly, still cautious. "You jest," she said. She had only ever known the cold, icy walls of the catacombs. "My name is Stadius," he said. "I am a poet who has published works, and yet here I stand face to face with the inspiration of my next." She smirked, then snickered, and finally laughed. When she laughed, it was as if time stopped again. Stadius looked, his mouth agape, as the beauty seemed to caress him, almost crush him in its iniquity. She began to rub her eyes from the laughter, her smile still apparent. "You're such an awkward bastard child," she said. Stadius felt as if his very soul had been crushed from that sentence. "You test me," he said, his voice only half joking. No, it's fine," she assured him, still smirking. "I have a fluttering affinity for strange people." Just like that, Stadius's heart was lit up again. "Do you wish to have somebody around? I have nothing to do this night," he said. "Do you have time for a silly poet?" San Lamort hesitated. "My father would kill me," she muttered. "No matter, absolutely no matter. After all, I have been trying to escape the hands of an evil man, albeit not my father." The woman laughed again, and Stadius's heart was caressed with utter joy. "I suppose we're both sulky fugitives, then." Stadius, in a stupor, sat down by the river, and after a long pause, the woman cautiously joined him. They began talking about random things, food, flowers, music, but Stadius was hardly listening. He was looking into her hair, her eyes, the way her form seemed to grace the water. There was something so elegantly and so utterly sublime about how her eyes refracted off of the river's surface. Finally, the woman laughed and asked, "You're not listening, are you? Are you perhaps slow in the head?" Stadius, bewildered, chuckled. "Nay," he said. "I was just thinking about how your eyes refract off the water. I tell you, if this was the last thing I saw, I would be as if an Oedipus in joy." The woman's heart set itself to beat fast. Her face flushed. She stood up suddenly, stepping back towards the catacombs in a stupor. "Wait, I didn't mean anything by it," Stadius called. "You're going to kill me with your beautiful words," she replied, her voice light but trembling. She clutched her heart as if the words simultaneously made her pained and utterly beautified. Stadius looked up at her, his hands still resting against the earth. "If you need to be wrapped in the hush of midnight," he said, "please do not hesitate to come out to this walk-lake, and at this time, every day, when the moon hits the center of the river, meet me here, every night." The woman hesitated. "You don't have to do that," she muttered. "I figured you could use a friend." At these words, Morte could not contain a smile. "Then sneak, and do not waver," she said. And just like that, she disappeared into the darkness of the catacombs. Scene 2. Into the mouth of Hades. Stadius lay awake all night. The laughter of the court, its hedonistic moans, the clinking of drinks, and the wailing of the Sun King, it was all replaced by the calm sound of water and the moonlight. He lay staring up at the sky as if entranced by the uncreated light. Maybe this wasn't the hand of God, but it certainly was one of his handiworks. Stadius furiously blushed, thinking about how her hand had reached back into her hair. The fractals in her eyes were all he could think about. Her rags to him were like a lace dress. This, my friends, is Kierkegaard's maddening. But this humble Frenchman and poet, Stadius, would find his greatest pain and anguish, his greatest crucifixion, his greatest resurrection, and his greatest solace in her. The afternoon sun draped the court in languid gold, a slow, syrupy haze filtering through the ornate windows of Versailles. Stadius paced, his boots clicking softly against the polished marble, his fingers running absently over the stitched leather of his journal. The court swayed with its usual idleness. Noblewomen fluttered their fans like porcelain butterflies. Men gathered in quiet conspiracies over chessboards and goblets of wine. A trio of musicians plucked lazily at their lutes in a shaded alcove. A summer wind stirring the long curtains with a sigh. Stadius could hear their laughter, the idle talks of debts and duels, of mistresses and masquerades, of things that had no weight, no soul. And a sound as empty as the Gilden halls they echoed through. And then a hushed voice cut through the lull like a dagger into silk. "They say she lives beneath the palace. A bastard child of the king himself, did you know? Ah, but a mother, a Puritan of all things, some heretical wretch. The Sun King has hidden her away all these years. They say she was cursed by God himself." "Cursed?" "Aye. Anyone who touches her dies." The words wrapped around Stadius like a noose. He stopped pacing. The room continued to move, the world still spun on its idle revelry, and yet Stadius felt as if the air had been stolen from him, not by fear, not by revulsion, but by grief. A grief so thick, so unspeakable, that it settled in his bones like a winter frost. Cursed. It was not the age of reason. It was not a word from the age of reason. It was a word from an older time, from myth and omen, from whispers at the foot of the scaffold. It was a word that kings wielded like axes. But what was a curse, truly? Was it not merely the name men gave to suffering that they could not comprehend, to sorrow too unbearable to look upon? Stadius clenched his jaw, his breath felt sharp in his throat. The court had turned back to its dull amusements. Oblivious to the ache in his chest, he turned swiftly, striding out of the saul, out of the golden sun, out of the haze and comfort and indulgence, back into the arms of the cold evening. The moon was not yet high when he returned to the walkway by the river. The basin of the Seine swallowed the last light of day, the water folding into itself, dark and endless. Stadius pulled his cloak tighter around him, his breath curling into the midnight air, and there, as if she had never moved from their first meeting, she stood, wrapped in the tattered hush of rags, the laurels still wilting in her hair, her figure cast in silver light. For a moment, he simply looked. She did not dance this time. She merely stood, her face half hidden in the shadows, watching him as he approached. "You came back? Why, you Orphic fiend! Did you think I wouldn't?" he smirked. "After seeing Eurydice hushed in the grove, how could I not? Most men would run screaming if they heard what you did, pouring your heart out with a cursed thing like me. Then most men are cowards. I too dislike vanity." A dry chuckle left her lips, though there was no humor in it. You shouldn't be here. You absolutely shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be alone, wrapped in a burying cloth." She flinched. For a moment, the mask of cold indifference cracked, but she held her ground. "You heard, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice fairly carried by the wind. Stadius did not answer, but his face, his grief, his sorrow said everything. You pity me. You must want my body or my face, or deep down you must want to kill me. I mourn for you. You're the most beautiful thing on the fabric of the universe." Her gaze sharpened. "And what, dear poet, do you mourn?" "That the world sees you as something to be hidden, as something to be feared, rather than a soul to be loved." Her hands clenched into fists. "Love? Ha! What love is there for me? The love of a father who locks me in a crypt, the love of a mother who died bearing me, who left me with nothing but a name I did not ask for, the love of people who whisper curses rather than grieve for the child beneath them." Her voice rose, a storm breaking against the stone. "There is no love for a thing that kills." Stadius stepped closer. "And yet," he whispered, "here I stand, wanting everything to do with you." She opened her mouth, but no words came. For a long moment they merely stood. The moonlight swelled in its silence. The wind stirred the water in slow ripples. For the first time, San Morte looked at him without wariness, without caution. She did not smile, but the ice around her eyes softened. The tension in her shoulders ceased, just enough. "You're a fool, poet, an utter fool. I've been called worse, far, far worse." A beat of quiet. It felt like an eon's passing. The candlelight flickering their shadows on the wall. Like Plato's society, they are trapped in illusion. But as the warm embrace of the torches cast their forms together in that two-dimensional plane, their differences meant nothing. They were rotten black forms trying to make each other real. For the first time, San Morte's insecurities quieted into genuine concern. "You should leave. Please, and go before. I heard you go before me. I don't want to lose something as fragile as you in the universe." "I don't want to. I want your eyes. I want your love." She sighed again, shaking her head, but for the first time she did not tell him to go. Instead, she turned her face toward the river, gazing at the water as if it could tell her some hidden truth. "Come again if you must, but do not waver," she murmured, her voice barely above a breath. Stadius bowed his head. "I never do. You can ask that bastard on the throne." And with that, she slipped into the darkness of the catacombs once more. Stadius exhaled, pressing a hand over his heart as if trying to quiet the storm inside him. This was not a curse. This was not a monster. This was a tragedy. And he would not look away. Scene 3, a taste of Eurydice. Stadius came back the next day, standing at the entrance of the catacombs, a little bit afraid. The entrance to the catacombs loomed before him like the maw of some forgotten beast, yawning and endless, its breath thick with damp stone and the scent of dust long disturbed. The torchlight from the palace above barely kissed its edges, leaving the abyss below untouched by the sun. Stadius hesitated. Not out of fear. He had long abandoned that in pursuit of poetry, of truth, of beauty. No, this was something else. A strange reverence, an understanding that he was about to step beyond the world of men into something more ancient, more sacred. This was an Orphic descent, a pilgrimage into Hades, and waiting for him in the depths was not a ghost, nor a wraith, nor a monster, but a girl whom the world had already condemned to the realm of the dead. Taking a breath as though preparing for baptism, he stepped forward, his boots pressing into the damp earth beneath. The silence was thick, almost tangible. It swallowed the echoes of his footsteps, wrapped around him like a burial shroud. The deeper he went, the further Versailles faded. No longer could he hear the laughter of the nobles, nor the distant songs of the minstrels. Here, the world belonged to shadows and echoes, to the ghost of monks who had whispered their last prayers in these halls, to relics long forgotten by those who had built them. And then, as if conjured from the air itself, she was there. San Morte stood in the glow of a single candle, its light flickering, licking the sharp angles of her face, casting her in the hues of a Caravaggio painting. Darkness clung to her form like mourning robes, yet the way she tilted her chin, the defiance in her stillness, made her look like an empress enthroned among ruins. "You hesitated." Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the cavernous space. "I did," Stadius admitted. He did not lie. A poet had no use for lies. "Why?" He exhaled, stepping closer. Because this is not a place of the living, and you are so out of place in it. She huffed, arms folding over her chest. Yet here we stand, you being Orpheus among the throngs of Hades. Yes, how could I not, to my Eurydice? Your skin hushes any objection that I may get from the carnival above. A moment passed, a moment that stretched and sighed as slow as the dripping water from the ceiling. She was stunned to silence. You don't fear me? She asked at last. I do not. Then you are a fool. I've been called worse. A shadow of a smirk ghosted over her lips, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She turned from him then, walking further into the depths of the catacombs, past old stone alcoves where saints had once been laid to rest, past crumbling engravings of prayers no longer spoken. Tell me, poet. Her voice was softer now, more measured. What is love to you? Stadius followed her, his hands tucked into the folds of his coats. Love is a passion, he mused, but not the passion the world speaks of. It's not hunger, it's not fire, it's not something that consumes merely to satisfy. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, intrigued, but silent. It is a passion to give, he continued, his voice almost reverent, as though speaking of something sacred. To empty oneself, to be poured out like water into another's hands. It is a thing that asks for nothing, yet gives everything. Love does not seek to own or to be owned. It is a surrender, a willing surrender to something greater than oneself. Son of Morte stopped walking. The candlelight trembled. And you? Stadius asked, tilting his head. What is love to you? Her fingers curled slightly, her nails digging into the fabric of her sleeves. She thought she was the most disgusting thing to ever grace the gates of hell. But what he saw was an icon inside of a chapel during Vespers. A sickness. The word left her lips like a bitter wind. A fever that infects the mind, a cruelty men tell themselves is a blessing. Love is a thing that has only ever betrayed me, only ever promised warmth and delivered nothing but exile. She put his hands out, feigning, wanting to touch him, trying to scare her own insecurities away. A vain thing! People used to justify their own insidious, ugly behavior. They rape, they steal, they kill, and then they justify it in feign ignorance and act like they didn't just commit something that would make Bacchus blush. Stadius did not flinch, did not protest. He merely watched her. And yet, he murmured, you are here, wrapped in what I can only describe as an angel's robe, lofted from a sail. Saint Lamort looked at him, fully, truly, looked at him, as though trying to decipher something she could not name. And yet here I am, being serenaded by some idiot. The candles sputtered, casting wild shadows along the stone walls. Something swelled in the space between them, something neither of them dared to name. Stadius reached into his coat, pulling forth a single glove of soft black leather. Slowly, deliberately, he slid it onto his right hand. Son Lamorte's breath caught. He lifted his arm, moving with the patience of a sculptor, as though she were carved from something far more delicate than marble. The gloved fingers reached for her face. She did not move away. And then, a touch, a single fleeting caress of leather against her cheek, her skin cool as the moonlit river. The world seemed to hold its breath. Son Lamorte's lips parted. Her body stiffened, yet she did not recoil. It was the first time in her life that another had touched her without fear, the first time someone had reached for her without recoiling in terror. Her eyes burned. Stadius smiled, just barely, just enough for the candlelight to catch the curve of his lips, and then just like that, he was gone. His footsteps faded into the dark, leaving her standing there, fingers ghosting over her cheek, the heat of his touch still lingering beneath the chill of the underground. And in that moment, Son Lamorte knew. She had fallen, not into some maddening sickness, rather into a baptism. Her tears etched down her face. She had never even been attempted to be touched. She cried like an ivory icon, alone, flickering into the candlelight. She had fallen into Kierkegaard's love, and the love of the crucified man. Act 2. The dialogues in the Delta and the warnings of the bishop. Scene 1. Maddening arrows and a glass of wine. Stadius did not sleep. He tried, oh, how he tried, but his body rejected it, tossing and turning like a ship caught in a storm. She was in his bones, his lungs, and his blood. He saw her in the reflection of the ink on the page. He saw her in the way the candlelight wavered. He saw her in the way the river curled and broke against the stone. She was a fever in his veins, a baptism he had not asked for and yet had drowned in willingly. Sometimes when the guards would pass, they would hear him singing under his breath, songs that he would just make up on the spot, trying to capture even a morsel of the poetic justice he had found in her eyes. The man had virtually gone mad, quit eating, or at the very least ate erratically. Each night the king grew restless. Thomas Hobbes cringed, towering over his canted pieces of philosophy that would kill millions. The Sun King began to think, with his black matted hair and his inbred face, that his poet had been struck by some kind of sickness. The good king one day came to his quarters with a few guards and concubines and a glass of wine. "Good day, my friend. The night is young. You seem so tense out of late. Drink, drink!" Your Majesty," Stadius had stated, "I apologize for my lack of communication with you. I have been working on my next work." "Is not eating and singing yourself into flights of fancy your way of writing?" "I suppose it is." "Perhaps you wish to take part in one of my lovely brides?" Stadius looked up furious and bewildered. "What?" The thought to Stadius was blasphemous. It was like someone locking the Virgin Mary to him, or the crucified man himself. You seem so tense. You need to loosen up. You haven't joined our feast." I told you, I'm fine. I don't need to join. It distracts me from my... I bet it does. Wine, women, all of that. "Your Majesty, if you don't mind, could you bring the bishop to my quarters?" Your old friend?" "Yes, the bishop. Valentine, right?" "Yes." "That will be done. But at least drink some wine. It will help you loosen up a bit. We wouldn't want the one man writing arias and poems to be staggered in his work, now would we?" "I suppose not." The king waltzed out, as if being processed in an unholy matrimony. Scene 2. The warning from the old guard. The bishop came in due time. The sun was beginning to set, yet it had not hit the horizon, and certainly the moon had not yet met the center of the river. "Hello, my child." The Bishop of War wore his usual attire. The man was fitting for a priest, a dead man in garb who had long since renounced the world's evil, yet whom the polity dragged with him on a daily basis. "If it isn't the first communion I have ever served!" "I suppose it is." "What is it, my child?" The bishop sat on his chair looking in Stadius's eyes. He could see they were not himself. "What kind of passionate curse has befallen you this time?" "I'm in love." "I beg your pardon?" "I'm in love." The priest couldn't believe his ears. Stadius was never the popular type, always sunk into a book, always writing poetry that the nobles found to be highly wishy-washy, but were filled with hidden truths that only the peasants could understand. "Who's the lucky woman?" "That's what I need to talk to you about." "Go on." "She was by the walkway near the catacombs." The bishop's expression shifted. "Her eyes refracted off the water. Now I am utterly in love." The priest straightened in his seat. "You said she was by the catacombs?" "Yes, she was by the catacombs." Bishop Valentine noticeably fidgeted, his horror and hesitancy betraying something more. "Stadius, what was her name?" The poet hesitated. "I knew you were going to ask that." "What was her name, Stadius?" "Son Morte." The bishop exhaled sharply. "Oh, heavens! You know of the curse, too? It is quite the scandal around here. I cannot believe this. Are you an idiot, Stadius? An absolute buffoon?" "But she's beautiful. She kills people, Stadius. She's a girl. Look, stay away from her. I cannot have another scandal. You're just like the rest of those bacchanalian fools. Has the Sun King taken you into his own feast, too, O man of God?" "Stadius, stay your tongue." Stadius sunk back into his chair. "I want her alive, too, you know." "No, you don't." "Who do you think has been getting her provisions, her water, her food? How do you think she has those amenities in her room? That was me, not some god, not a member of the court. Me, Stadius." Stadius quieted. He was slightly bewildered at such a notion. "I can't have both of you die. Me and her were also friends. I'm not angry with you, Stadius. I'm not angry with her. It's just that you two need to stay separated, so the king doesn't have her killed, or have you killed, or have her accidentally hurt you. Aren't you a man who worships a god who got beaten by the polity and was crucified, and you call that love? Stadius, that's blasphemous. How so? I can't justify that. She's a girl, Valentine. That's Father Valentine. Cut the buffoonery. She's a woman. You didn't see her down there. The bishop sighed deeply. You won't listen to me, Stadius. I can't help you. She pressed his fingers against his temple. I deeply care for both of you. You keep a girl locked in a crypt and you call that love? It's because the king would have her executed otherwise. Stadius clenched his fist. Listen to me for once in your life, Stadius. This is not a good idea. The poet's voice cracked. The bishop eased off the staff he was holding, reclined back in his chair. His face softened just slightly. Whatever. He exhaled smoke from his pipe, staring at the ceiling. If you go and see her, I will not stop you. I will not tell anyone either. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Stadius rose silently. His journal clenched tensely in his hand. Love conquers death, sir. The bishop leaned back in his chair, lit his tobacco pipe, and began to pray. God protect those two. Scene 3. Pathetic, romance, and arrows. As he stepped outside, his anger turned into a mere sigh. The night air was crisp, wrapping Stadius in its cold embrace as he made his way towards the catacombs once more. The river Send glistened, its surface a molten silver ribbon under the moon's omniscient gaze. His heart pounded, not out of fear, nor even of trepidation, but out of sheer, foolish, poetic longing. He knew he should not be here. He knew that this presence only complicated what was already a delicate and perilous thing. But poets are not creatures of reason. He found himself once again by the base of the river, where the water met the dampened stone. The hard stone and the water seemed to dance. She was there, just as before, wrapped in the hush of midnight. Her hair shimmered like the halo of a saint, the moonlight bending itself to illuminate her form. She was wearing a crown of wilted flowers, her fingers moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent years alone, crafting beauty where none should grow. Stadius took a deep breath, and with all the grace of a young boy attempting to court a courtesan, leaned against the wall. He crossed his arms and tilted his head a little bit, ever so slightly. It was a disaster. Son of Morte glared up at him, raising an eyebrow. Why are you standing like that, wrapped in such illustrious attire, no less? Stadius straightened immediately, as if standing at attention. Like what? Like a pigeon who's just realized it's being watched, and it's about 15 seconds from a flight after an archer just came into view. He coughed into his fist and stepped closer, undeterred. I meant only to appear as one of those tragic poets, doomed to love, bound to solitude, drunk on the fragrance of moonlit company. She blinked. You look like you're about to fall over. He deflated, rubbing the back of his neck. Perhaps tragedy comes in many forms, such as my stupidity here. A silence stretched between them, but not an uncomfortable one. If anything, there was an air of amusement radiating from her. You're not good at this whole, she said at last, setting her flower crown aside. At what? Courting thing. Stadius gasped, placing a hand over his heart. Madame, you wound me. Nay, it's fine, she chuckled, shaking her head. I suppose I have an Orpheus now. She watched as she turned back to her flower, suddenly feeling lighter, as if he had not just humiliated himself beyond redemption. The stars above seemed to burn brighter in his relief. She looked at him again, tilting her head ever so slightly. Why do you keep coming back? Like some madman trying to commune with a dead lover. Stadius hesitated and then smiled. Perhaps because I have never seen something more beautiful than how the moonlight refracts in your eyes. If you're dead, then you're surely fooled me. He leaned down next to her, staring straight into his heaven, which was her eyes. You're my Eurydice, a nymph singing in the moonlight, laced in the river she waltzed in. Son of Morte inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the petals she had been holding. For the first time, her composure cracked, not in alarm nor in fear, but in something closer to wonder. Then, as if seeking to escape it, she stood abruptly, a smile creeping across her lips, like a cunning vixen. Come with me. Like Rumi looking into the divine light, utterly annihilated. He took her hand. Stadius, like a drunken madman, touched her hand, not even occurring to him that he was wearing gloves, and if he hadn't stumbled those gloves on, he would have been dead. She led him towards the edge of the river, where the water lapped gently against the stone. There, beneath the vast cathedral of the night sky, she extended her hand towards him. Stadius hesitated. "I... Dance with me, just for a while. Ease my dead soul, please," she whispered. He exhaled slowly, then took her hand. As his hand touched hers, it was like being annihilated slowly, an intoxication of Eden long ago. It was like stepping behind the veil into heaven. Stadius, madly and brutally, didn't even care about the fact that if he hadn't obscured himself in the gloves, Death would have found her first caress in him. Saint Death would no longer just be a moniker. There was no music, only the rhythm of the wind, the hush of the river, and the silent hymn of the universe. He placed his hand lightly over her waist, careful, always careful, as if she were something fragile, as if she might dissolve into the moonlight should he hold her too tightly. They swayed, moving in time with nothing but each other. The world shrank, and all that remained was the warmth of her presence, the way her hair cascaded over her shoulders, the way her lips parted, ever so slightly in some unsung prayer. She closed her eyes. He leaned forward, and just as their lips were about to meet, Stadius realized that he had somehow fumbled his way into gloves and didn't even think to cover his face. He stepped back slowly in horror, knowing he could have just killed himself. He pulled away, stepping back as if burned. San Morte's eyes fluttered open, confusion blooming on her face. "Stadius?" He took another step back. I should go. I was just..." Her lips parted, but no words came. San Morte remained, standing by the river's edge. The world around her continued, indifferent to the ache in her chest. She looked up at the moon. "You are cool," she murmured to it, voice barely above a whisper. "You are full, whole, but you know nothing of longing. You stand there watching me, defiant in your gaze, silver. What does he see in me that he doesn't see in you? I'm a wretch, completely broken. I have been beaten by illustrious men. I have been forced to kill." She touched her cheek where his gloved hand had been. She closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, San Morte, daughter of a king cursed by birth, trapped beneath stone, knew what it meant to yearn. It was an agony, a beautiful, painful agony that seeped its way into her, like being plunged into Dante's Eighth Circle, set only for heretics. Scene 4. Purgation. Stadius was now in a trance, sickly and mad. Stadius stumbled into the alley above the catacombs, the weight of the night crushing his chest. The moment he was out of sight, his body betrayed him, and he doubled over, purging himself of all the wine, all the weight, all the sheer madness writhing within him, as the liquid spilled from his lips like dried ichor, tumbling onto the stone beneath him, as if he were being purged of something reviling. His hands clutched the wall, his breath ragged, his chest heaving. He had almost touched her. In his blind passion, he had almost killed the very thing his lover loved. Yet maddeningly, defying all reason, all sanity, all the self-preservation that should have been stitched into his being, he decided right then and there, as his body trembled from the exertion, that he would figure out some way to kiss her. Any sane man would have run, any wise man would have shuddered, or at the very least recoiled with some semblance of hesitation. Most men saw love nothing more as a putrid business transaction, a wretched barter of flesh and advantage. But Stadius was now a fool. And in his folly, he was wiser than every leering wretch in that court. He had touched something beyond the abyss, beyond the veil of sadness that the romanticist could only dream of. And now all he could think about was wrapping his lips around hers, crowning his eve in the veil of moonlight. Now the poet had utterly gone insane. Yet he would be a fool in the world's eyes, and a beautiful thing in the eyes of Raphael and God. Act 3. La scène sous la scène. Scene 1. Baptismal robes. Stadius did not sleep that night. Luckily, the king was inundated with 5 women at the time, for the great feast was coming, a throng of hell unlike any other. But today, for Stadius, was a joyous day, for he had already devised a plan. That is, if he could bring his fragile poet's heart to see it to fruition. As he stepped out groggily, in his blue and yellow overcoat, he wove his way to the kitchen, where the men were stuffing their faces full of food. He merely grabbed a small plate of breakfast, eating little, the bishop sitting in the corner nodding in silent understanding. Knowing that he had cover, Stadius slipped out unnoticed during breakfast. Now they truly thought he had gone mad. But no matter, The king was occupied indulging himself in a revelry so grotesque that even the most decadent men in the hills of L.A. would blush. However, what was happening in the Sun King's room put the lavish feast of P. Diddy himself to shame. However, this was France. It's the 1600s. Decadence was always oozing from the halls. Stadius slipped away, this time not under the hush of midnight, but beneath the harsh sun and the pasty blue sky. He carried a few peculiar items with him: a brown paper bag, 2 gloves, and 2 tickets for a ferry ride on the Seine. The conniving bishop had managed to steal them from a pair of nobles who had passed out together in their drunken stupor. This was going to be a night of laughter and dreams, a sacred night set apart from all the evil and debauchery. But as he stepped into the catacombs, something strange met his eyes. Morte, who was supposed to remain locked away in darkness, was outside, sitting in the river beneath the golden daylight. She looked up at him, blushed, and then laughed. "I was feeling a little bit rebellious today. I wanted to meet the loveliest of Aeneas, wrapped in the idiotic poet's clothes," she said, smiling mischievously. Stadius could hardly breathe. She stood, her rags matted but cleansed of dust, the filth of her prison washed away by the water's touch. She wore something like a baptismal font, something a theophany would be undergone in. The pasty matted cloth, once torn and tattered, had been transformed into a garment of light, something beyond earthly beauty, something holy. For what felt like an eternity, though it was more than probably 15 seconds, Stadius stood, mouth agape, more of a madman than he had ever been. The sun glistened on the water, her reflection cast upon the river's surface like a painting. Her eyes were soft yet luminous, like Siddhartha walking from beneath the Bodhi tree. "I am utterly enthralled. Please grant me the satisfaction of not lighting yourself on a funeral pyre." At this, Morte threw her head back and laughed. A laugh like a howling wind, a laugh that shattered years of sorrow. All the pain, all the anger, all the loneliness and despair were stripped away in that single sound. It was beautiful, and Stadius was losing himself in it. She laughed so hard she fell backwards into the water. Panic shot through Stadius. He rushed to the riverbank, hands outstretched. But she simply and elegantly emerged from the shallow, shaping droplets from her skin. "Fear not," she teased. "The water is shallow, unlike your words." Still breathless, Stadius watched her, utterly entranced. Then Morte swam to the bank and leaned up towards him, inches from his face. She tilted her head, the whole world tilting with it, eyeing the odd assortment of objects in his hand. "Say," she began, curiosity flickering in her gaze, "why do you have those peculiar items? And what's with this strange getup? You look like you walked out of a circus or a madrigal." Stadius, a passionate and soft-hearted man, never was given to the vanity of masculine stoicism. He looked down like a lovesick boy, fumbling for words he couldn't believe he was about to say. "Tonight, 8 o'clock. Do you want to join me on the ferry to have a little scene on the River Seine?" For the first time, Morte saw it. The utter sublimity in Stadius. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the anguish, all the nights spent cursing herself, all the bitterness, all the grueling words of King Louis, all the bishop's warnings, all the night she spent weeping in silence, all the time she had wished to tear her own eyes from their sockets because she hated seeing the world so lonely. All of it vanished in that instant, replaced by the love she saw in Stadius's eyes, that passionate longing, that devotion refracted off the river, the same particles of moonlight now baptized in the sun. She began to cry, and she smiled. "Nothing would please me more. If my hands weren't razor sharp and would stab into your beautiful heart, I think I would kiss you." Stadius could not contain himself. He jumped in the air like a man who had just won the lottery. Be here! I want to see thy precious gaze across the water," he shouted, nearly shaking with glee. Morte laughed, wiping tears, her smile brighter than the sun itself. "Do not waver, my love," she whispered. There was a fire in that man, a fire that utterly repulsed the members of the court. The once raving lunatic, the anguished and sad poet, had become something they could not fathom. A child. King Louis sneered when he saw him later that day, smirking with perverse satisfaction. For after all, he was the Sun King, and an absolutist. Stadius spent the next 5 hours in his room singing, like a priest waiting upon the joy of a feast day. Scene 2. The Sacré-Cœur on the Seine. As soon as the sun kissed the horizon, he ran out in a stupor. King Louis smirked and laughed, throwing his head back lifelessly. Little did he know, his most precious secret, Treasure was about to be pilfered, and he would be none the wiser. He made it to the pier opposite of the catacombs and saw her waiting. Veiled in moonlight, dressed in her cleansed rags, stood Saint Morte. Stadius approached in a daze, loosely fiddling with the gloves in his pockets, just barely able to put them on, like a priest holding communion in his hands. Once he got them on, he anxiously started tossing the paper bag from one hand to the other. The man was utterly beside himself. She watched his strange fumbling with quiet amusement, something delightful about his nervous clumsiness, for her only friends had been the walls of the catacombs, and the damp bones of saints who had seen her anguish and wept. But no matter, this night was sacred. Stadius, completely lost in his thoughts, hastily shoved the gloves into his front pocket, and in sheer nervousness placed the brown paper bag on his head. Saint Morte, who had been gazing at the river, turned to him and burst into laughter. A full, radiant, ringing laughter, like silver bells echoing in the hollow night. The fairy opened its wooden mouth to swallow its guest. The nobles and their ladies looked on in distaste as the two strange figures stepped aboard. Women snickered behind their silk fans. Men shielded their wives, covering their children's eyes, horrified at the sight of this madman with a bag on his head, and a woman who looked like if she had just walked straight out of a baptismal font. But no matter. The night had just begun. Stadius, in his mischievous delight, had stolen a few coins from King Louis's drawer and bought them ice cream. "Here, my lady," he said, handing her the largest one. She raised an eyebrow at him. "You truly are a strange man," she muttered, taking the ice cream anyway. "And you," he said, watching her take the first bite, "are a queen unthroned." She smiled, licking a drop of melting cream from her thumb. "A queen of bones and dust. A queen nonetheless." They ate together, laughing, speaking of nonsense, of birds, of rivers, of flowers, and of poets long dead. At some point, Stadius made a joke about King Louis, something so wickedly blasphemous that Saint Morte nearly choked on her ice cream. She clutched her sides, gasping between peals of laughter. "You're gonna get yourself executed, you ridiculous fool!" "If death is the price of laughter," he declared, striking a dramatic pose, "then let me be drawn and quartered, so long as I die amusing you." The music began, a tango, a waltz, something slow and sensual, like the soul being torn to pieces. Saint Morte, still smiling, tilted her head at the sound, and her body moved before she could stop it. A slight swaying, a shifting of the weight, her feet skimming the floor as if testing it. Then fully, swept by the melody, she began to dance. It was not practiced, it was not elegant, it was something entirely her own. Stadius watched, entranced. This was heaven. Not the ice cream, not the moon, not the music, but her. The way she lifted her fingers to try to gauge the stars, the way her laughter lilted into the wind, the way her feet bare and unshackled, gilded over velvet like she was walking where angels trod. She turned to him suddenly, her hair catching in the wind. "Why do you wear that ridiculous bag?" He blinked as if waking from a dream. "Because I am a fool," he said plainly. He didn't want to give away the surprise. That bag would bring a communion of persons. She smirked. "That much is obvious." A silence. The music swelled. Saint Morte reached out a hand. "Then dance, fool." And so he did. They spun across the deck, a poet and his saint, laughing and tripping, colliding into each other. Stadius did not wear that coat and that paper bag and those gloves for nothing. Rather, he wore them so in his spinning with his baptized lover they could be annihilated into the real, like an old Sufi mystic. Spinning, remembering the real, a passionate rebellion against the evils of the world, they spun as they held each other. They became lost in each other's eyes. The gloves ceased to mean anything to Saint Morte. His eyes, his lips, were far more a beautiful satisfaction. Stadius had reached the veil of the Empyrean. The moonlight refracted on the water as the oratorio tore them to pieces. Together, the sublime and utter desolation, it was as if all of their insecurities died in their spinning, their longing and their yearning. The nobles gawked in disgust, the boatmen watched in silence, and the moon smiled upon them. The night was sacred. They were so entranced with each other, they danced their way from the inside of the boat to the outside. And then, as the final note of the waltz lingered in the air, Stadius cupped her face, gloves, hands trembling, and leaned in. But he hesitated. The world stood still. Saint Morte's breath stilled. Her eyes searched his lips, parted, waiting. But he pulled away. The man had come so close! The agony of vanity was keeping him from fully expressing his love! He started crying under his own breath, absolutely in utter desolation. Why? Why couldn't he do it? Love is cruciform, as the bishop said. Why was he scared? He had gloves on, he had a paper bag on. Why should it have mattered? There was nothing but an inky black silence now. But God had other plans, and Providence came in clutch. Just then, a wave hit the boat. She barely had time to react before, splash! The fool had tripped over his own feet and had fallen straight off the boat. For a moment, all was silent. The nobles gasped, the woman shrieked. Morte stared, utterly dumbfounded, and then she laughed, loud and free, wild and untamed thing. The poet flailed in the water, sputtering, "I meant to do that!" he called. Morte, still laughing, knelt by the edge and reached down ahead. "Come, my love," she teased. "You look like a dried leaf, hardly a look for such a thing of the night." He grasped her hand, and just as he did, the boat lurched. The sudden movement sent her toppling over, and before she could stop herself, she too fell into the river. Another great splash. Another gasp from the nobles. The lovers disappeared from the Seine, swallowed by the dark water, wrapped in a sacred baptism. Scene 3. Theophany. Somewhere above, the moon wept in silver. Under the water, the two lovers swam. They could barely see each other. Stadius realized the gloves had fallen off, and his paper bag, too. He gasped in horror, the water sucking into his mouth. Just as he realized this, laughing and smiling like an angel falling from heaven, like lightning, she fell, colliding with him in the process. But instead of Satan, it was the archangel Raphael, descending to comfort Tobit, wrapped in the hues of midnight. No cover to hide them, no mask to veil them. There was absolutely nothing between them. They were just two souls. Two maddened lovers floated suspended in a sunbeam. Without anything to cover his hands, his skin sank into hers until they wrapped around each other like an amorphous blob, because the water acted as a barrier. On a divine technicality, an act of splendor, my God, they were not touching. Liquid being but liquid does, they could actually hold each other without worrying, without the saint of death having to cry for her lover. That 30 seconds they held each other felt like an eternity. Their forms became one, wrapped on the strand of silk, outside of Plato's cave. There was no need to light as Dido. There was no need to weep as Jocasta hangs. There was no need to partake of the feast of Dionysian revelry. The force suspending them in the water was aching love, waiting to be crucified. It was as if the Empyrean from Dante came down and wrapped itself around them, like St. Bernard standing with Rachel. Like glass and fractals, she glistened, she gleamed, she glowed, and like sunlight, it wrapped itself on his skin. His whole body lit up in such a warmth that it almost hurt. All of the vain presuppositions about her, her rags, her face sinking into his breast, her quietness softly laying her cheeks into his neck became as nothing. They were merely body and soul, a composite in his hands leaning into the touch, a communion of persons, a dyad. Stadius in that moment would have let himself drown. How could he not? For he would have been utterly elated in the arms of the only thing he could never have. All of the arias he had ever written, all of the poetic anguish poured into words would have meant nothing in relation to this. The soft skin against his, suspended in the very fabric of reality. The water, rather than being blue, felt white. As she touched his skin and leaned into him, her tears coalescing with the white abyss, he held his lover for the first time under a veil of sadness. She smiled, and if the Empyrean were true, Dante would be as ash. Because he realized that Saint Death, under the waters of baptism, under the pale moonlight, away from the polity and the whims of the Dane, she was not Saint Death, she was life. Soren Kierkegaard among the Empyrean was probably weeping. Like fractals, the water began to slowly subside into a white light. Her eyes, in the madness of the water, became a form. Plato's cave had been crossed asunder, and now there was only life. Stadius brought his hands up in the water and planted a kiss on her lips. Sinking, every aching, longing piece of pain and anger, every hit that he had suffered, every lonely and abyssal night poured into that kiss. Time seemed to slow. Rather, time didn't exist at all. There was no time. It was an eternity in a few seconds. It was as if the water they had somehow crossed beyond the abyss, into the river of chaos upon which God hung the waters. Christ laughed and smiled at them as angels surrounded them as they kissed. It was like a core being poured into a chalice. There was nothing but matter and form. All of the vain presuppositions, all of the evils of the polity, all of the anger and pain and anguish dissolved into nothingness. Perhaps Christ was in the water with them, utterly smitten, watching like a young girl reading a novella. That kiss was all of the anger, all of the passion, all of the vain whims of the polity, all of the despair, being baptized. As she broke the kiss, he placed his hands in her hair. She dissolved into it, feeling nothing but utter crucifixion in his touch. It was intoxicatingly painful, and for a moment nothing existed but pure, raw humanity. The Pharisees had died, the Sun King wept, wrapped in his absolutist horrors, for there was only love, only that which was real. For eternity's blissful stay, they remained entwined like silk touching the fabric of the sea of glass, until finally, in a stupor as they neared the surface, Stadius reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, a ruby ring, red like the blood of Christ. He had stolen it from a bone in the catacombs. He took her trembling hand, and he slid it onto her finger. They both knew what it meant, phenomenologically, but it did not register at the time. A proposal, yes, one they were too afraid to admit that had happened. And finally, the baptism ended. Just as they were about to break the surface, they parted, and immediately the longing, all of the vanity, all of the anguish of the world came rushing back in. They were at a loss for words as they swam to shore. They sat on the river bank, looking into the Seine. They wanted to touch again, to kiss again, to grace the waters of heaven one more time, but that would have to come later. The liturgy had ended, the feast had been served, and now they had to reconcile what just happened. They had gazed upon love himself. They had touched heaven. They had loved each other. Now they had to grapple with the agony of it. For now they simply sat staring into each other's eyes. No words, only blank expressions of pure awe. Sometimes one of them would glance back at the moon, as if searching for meaning. It was a stupor of madness, as slowly they regained their senses. Act 4, The Blood of the Sun King. Scene 1, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. The Palace of Versailles stood... My apologies. The Palace of Versailles stood in its golden splendor, a grotesque cathedral of hedonism towering and resplendent in the waning dusk. Outside, the heavens swelled like a terrible red, a dying sun bleeding into the earth, a great wound in the sky that seemed to sigh over the filth below. The feast of Bacchus was in full revelry, and the Maenads had already started cutting bodies. Inside, the halls writhed. 1,000 perfumes, 1,000 voices, the glistening of wine upon marble. A Dionysian hell. Nobles wrapped in silken rags, their laughter a cacophony of devils whispering behind fans. The wines flowed like blood, pooling in crystal goblets, spilling over the edges of trembling hands. Women lounged upon velvet, their forms draped like offerings before an altar. Men feasted like beasts, their hands drenched in oil, their lips stained crimson with the flesh of suckling pigs. And above it all, the Sun King, King Louis XIV, the Leviathan. To say no to him was to say no to Satan, masquerading as God. Seated at the head of a long, grotesque table, his body gilded in shadow and candlelight, the crown of France sat askew on his head, a relic of mockery. He was the fool of perpetual feast. He was the thing that had fallen like lightning in its own beauty. Satan had taken his reins. His eyes glowed like an abyssal kingdom, a living idol, his presence invoked like a god worshipped in fear and adored in vanity. Stadius stood at the periphery, his breath shallow. He had come to say goodbye. He had come to witness one last time the wretched empire he would soon forsake. But fate would lead him elsewhere. Even though he wanted to say goodbye, he could not bring himself to walk into the throne room. It was like once you exited the hall, you became less real. He wandered the halls, simply trying to find some place to sit and write. To write about this palace, but how he was going to leave with his angel. But as he stumbled past King Louis's chambers, he saw a closet that had almost always been locked in chains. Now it stood slightly ajar. The poet's curiosity, philosophical by nature, could not contain itself. It was as if he had peered into the forbidden world of Gnosis, like an old heretical mystic from days of old. But what he found was exactly what the Gnostics saw: pure and utter horror. The chamber of the dead. And there in the shadows, a horror beyond all reckoning. 40 bodies, perfectly lifeless, no sign of a struggle. Yet, as they slowly decomposed, they looked like small crucifixes on the ground. Someone had tried to make them into an art piece, a blasphemous display of mannequins covered in dirt rather than the rotting flesh of actual men. They were arranged in perfect symmetry, almost too perfect. A sterile crucifixion, where human beings were no longer human but commodities. The Sun King had not wasted them, nor drawn and quartered them with horses. No, with his inbred hands and Leviathan garments, he had done something worse. He had turned them into ornaments. This was an ossuary of treason, a cathedral of silent screams, and there, at the center, stood a chair. The fabric was torn, stained, as if someone had sat there and waited and wept and killed. Stadius did not move. A terrible, horrible knowing began to slither its way into his veins, sinking into his bones like the gates of hell had been torn asunder in his heart. His maddening became a delirium. He knew! He fell to his knees, touching his face. He wanted to scream the echoes of Solomon. He wanted to deny it, to admit none of this was real. All is vanity, said the teacher. He began deliriously screaming, wanting so desperately to tear out his eyes. What he saw was Jocasta hanging for Oedipus. No, what he saw was Dionysus ripping bodies apart and devouring them. But the most profane, the most blasphemous part of it all was that he realized who had sat on that profane throne. His angel. Son the Morte was not simply imprisoned. She had not simply been hidden away. She was the executioner. At this realization, he fell to the ground, screaming in pain and agony. All of the loneliness, all of his passion was forced asunder. Never in his life had he come as close to being Christ scourged, and Satan was sitting on the throne. And in that moment, he became death, destroyer of worlds. Scene 2, Pandemonium Regnat. Stadius did not remember walking to the feast, only that he arrived, already halfway drunk, already unraveling at the seams. He walked into hell and became one with it. He laughed, he sang, and he threw himself into the madness. He danced wildly, violently, like some pagan priest, his limbs erratic, his mouth filled with the taste of meat and wine. He screamed poetry into the void, verses of love and death, of pain and ecstasy. He stuffed his face drenched in the blood of the feast. The nobles laughed, the concubines cheered, and the Sun King watched with a smile, a knowing, terrible, devilish grin. Stadius froze. For the first time in all of his madness, he saw him. Really saw him. The way his lips curled at the edges, like his fingers tapped against the goblet, like a puppeteer watching his strings tighten, like a serpent watching his prey. And in that moment, Stadius understood. The Sun King had known all along. That wretched Leviathan, that Machiavellian prince, and that jester of perpetual feast. He had known that Stadius had fallen for the executioner. And he had led him. The Sun King was watching his final descent, watching him break, watching him become what he had always despised, a man of vice, a man of filth, a thing of a thing. No different from the rest of them. Stadius staggered back. The revelry collapsed around him. The walls pressed in. The air was gone. He turned and ran. Scene 3. Viva la Revolution. In this act of splendid rebellion, he turned crying and delirious, a man in pure, utter revolt. He did not care about his angel had passed over the doors of honorable men. He did not care that the blood of the Lamb had not been placed upon the doors of 40 souls. He had chosen in this moment to love beyond all utilitarian notions, to love in pure, utter crucifixion. He ran through halls gilded in gold, drenched in blood, through the whispers of ghosts, through the laughter of devils. The chapel was empty. The candle flickered, their flames bending towards heaven, but there was no warmth, only the heavy scent of old wax and incense. And there, the bishop was waiting. for he had known Stadius would come, because this is always how it ended. "Tell me," Stadius pleaded, his voice shaking. "Tell me everything. Tell me the truth." The bishop sighed. For the first time, he looked old. "The king never kills with the sword," he murmured. His hands clasped, his head bowed. "He never spills blood himself. That is beneath him." Stadius did not breathe. Instead, he used her, his own child, his own flesh, a girl, innocent and pure. The touch of an angel, wielded as the weapon of a god. A terrible silence. The bishop raised his eyes. San the Morte was never a monster, Stadius. She was made into one. Stadius felt his knees buckle. She was a girl who had never known choice, a girl who had never known mercy, a girl who had been made into death. And worst of all, she had believed it. She had believed herself to be a thing of a thing, a monster, a curse. Stadius had only seen an angel. The poet pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. The bishop leaned forward. "You still love her, don't you?" Stadius laughed. It was a small thing, a broken thing. "I love her beyond the grave," he whispered. "I want her as a seal upon my heart." The bishop sighed. "You have become Solomon." He met the poet's gaze. "Now reap the rewards of your wisdom." He found her in her room, beneath the earth among the bones. Now they seemed to be laughing at her weeping. Her back was to him, her shoulders shaking. She had heard the footsteps. She had known why he'd come. "Go," she whispered. "Don't torture me with your voice any more." Stadius did not move. Her fists clenched. "Go, Stadius, you know now. You know everything. You've seen it. You've seen..." She choked on her words. "Can't you just take the truth and run?" Her voice cracked. "Instead of beating my tattered heart like everyone else." She clenched her jaw. "Leave, please. I won't kill you. I won't let myself kill you. I won't let myself, a beautiful thing being taken off the earth." She was pushing him away, pushing herself away. She had lived her whole life being left behind. She would not bear it again. But Stadius stepped forward. He slid his gloves upon his hands, not as a sculptor, but as a man touching an icon reverently, as if the Theotokos herself laid before him. And he took her hands. They shook in his, like idols trembling on the altar. "Look at me," she refused. "San, look at me. Let me see thy paradise." Finally she did, and he smiled, softly, gently, like he had on the night they met, like he had every night after. "You think I will stop loving you because of this?" He shook his head. "You think me a man?" No. We are Orpheus and Eurydice, torn asunder," she gasped. "You think me dumb enough to join such a hell, to let you reap more? Do you think me stupid enough to stop loving God's creation just because it killed a man of honor?" She shook her head. No, you don't understand. I'm not some adulteress. I'm a murderer." He cupped her face. "I don't care." Her breath hitched. "Those objections mean nothing to me. Not in relation to the fractals in your eyes. I want to see them angelic and in their proper order." Tears fell. She collapsed into him, and for the first time in a life surrounded by death, she was held and she was loved. She had found life. Act 5. L'état c'est moi. I am the state. Scene 1. The Sans Culotte. The night lay thick upon Versailles, a heavy breathing thing. The air carried the scent of old stone, of melted wax, and of prayers lost to the vaults of time. For the first time, San the Morte had stepped out of her crypt. She moved cautiously, as if the world might shatter beneath her feet. She was wrapped in the hush of a borrowed cloak, the folds of midnight pulled around her like a funeral veil. Stadius led her by the hand, his grip firm, steadied, and anchored in devotion. The chapel door creaked as they stepped inside. The candlelight flickered, soft golden halos illuminating the old pews, the icons, and the quiet figure of the bishop, Valentine, waiting at the altar. His eyes, heavy with knowing, swept over the girl, the executioner, the cursed child, the wraith wrapped in rags. For a moment he said nothing. Then with a sigh, he gestured them forward. "You've done it," he murmured. "You've brought her into the light." Stadius nodded. "I want you to wed us." The words hung in the air. San the Morte flinched, Her fingers curled against Stadius's gloves, her breathing shallow. The bishop exhaled, rubbing his temple. Stadius, please, Stadius interjected. You're a bishop, for God's sake. If anybody can sanctify what the world has called blasphemy, it's you. The bishop leaned against the altar, weary. Do you have any idea what you're asking me to do? I'm asking you to do what is right. The bishop laughed bitterly at that. Right? The Sun King does not care for what is right. He cares for what is his. And she... He turned his gaze to Saint Morte. She is his daughter. She looked away. I don't care, Stadius said, his voice trembling. I don't care if she's the king's. I don't care if she's killed. I don't care if the world spits on us. I love her, and I refuse to let her rot in exile. Silence. A long, aching silence. Finally, the bishop sighed. Then I will plead for you. I will go before the king. Stadius' eyes went. You don't have to. I do. The bishop cut him off. His voice was soft but final. I have served a throne of tyranny for far too long. If I am to fall, let it be in defiance of the golden calf I once bowed before. Saint Morte finally looked up. And if he refuses? The bishop met her gaze. Then let God be my judge. Scene 2. Valentine in Babylon. The throne room was suffocating in golden silence. A single long table stretched between them. The king, seated at one end, a chalice of blood-red wine in his hand. Across from him, Bishop Valentine sat. The old priest inhaled deeply before speaking. I've come to plead with you, your majesty. The king took a slow sip of his wine, slow and lifeless. On whose behalf? On behalf of your daughter. The air stilled. The firelight trembled in the great iron candelabras. The king set his goblet down with deliberate slowness. My daughter? He echoed. His voice was smooth, like silk laid over a blade. The bishop swallowed. She has been your executioner, your exile, your curse, and yet she is still your own blood. I have come to ask for clemency. Let her go. Let her leave this palace and never return. King Louis tilted his head. And why, dear bishop, would I do that? Because it will rid you of the scandal. Valentine said calmly. The king exhaled a quiet laugh. You think me afraid of scandal? I think you're pragmatic. The girl will not cost you any further problems. A poet loves her. He will take her far away from here. Let her go, and she will never be your concern again. A slow silence. A long, unbearable quiet. Then the king stood, and in a voice cold as stone, as final as death, he uttered the words that sealed the fate of all. L'état c'est moi. I am the state. The words fell like a guillotine blade. The bishop closed his eyes. There was no negotiation. There was no mercy. There was only absolute sovereignty. The bishop stood, his chair straight against the marble like a defiant raise of a sword. He looked at the king, and then with a sudden righteous fury he reached forward and flipped the table like the scarred man in the temple. The golden goblets clattered on the ground. The wine spilled like blood. The king did not flinch. He simply watched. And the bishop, his chest heaving, as angry as a righteous thunder, coming down from the temple like the earthquake tearing the temple curtain, he turned toward the great idol of France and screamed with every man's voice who had ever been executed by the angel of death, "Nebuchadnezzar, there is writing on the wall!" And he stormed out like the archangel Michael over Moses' body. He had done it. He had defied the thieves in the Father's house, and now he would reap his reward. Scene 3. The matrimony of saints and the scourging. The chapel was dark, sacred, trembling in candlelight. Stadius and Saint Morte stood before the altar, the bishop lifting his trembling hands. This is a marriage of exiles, a wedding beyond the throne, a defiance of a god-king, and a union that no man, no king, may tear asunder. Saint Morte's hand shook. Stadius took them, steadied them. I'm ready, she whispered. The bishop looked at them both, then in the hush of midnight he spoke the vows. Saint Morte and Stadius exchanged rings, dead rings from the hands of bones, now redeemed in life. One went to Stadius's glove, now sacred with an angel's touch, and the other went to Saint Morte's, cold, dead hands now given flesh. The bishop blessed them, and in the silence of a crumbling empire, a cursed girl was wed, a poet became a husband, and a tyrant was defied. They fled. The woods beyond the palace swallowed them whole. The light welcomed them, and behind them the bishop was caught by guards the next mass. At dawn he was dragged before the people. The king did not torture him. There was no trial, only the gallows. They placed the noose around his neck, and as the sun rose over Versailles, Bishop Valentine smiled over the palace rafters. Stadius and Sainte de Morte watched from the tree line. She clutched his hand, tears streaming gently. Stadius did not cry. He simply whispered as the rope tightened, "A crown is waiting for you in heaven." The bishop closed his eyes, and the world went silent. The bishop was received into the air. The thing that had met Orpheus and Eurydice in the Seine, the god he had so faithfully served, welcomed to home and give him a robe and a crown. "Well done," the scarred man said beyond the veil. "I did what was right. I crucified myself just as you did. Then reap the rewards you sowed." Act 6, the finale, the Saint of Life. The world had forgotten them. They lived in the hush of the untamed wild, in a place untouched by the sun of France and the rot of its throne. No longer in the catacombs, no longer beneath stone. The sky stretched above them, wide, limitless, unbroken. The trees whispered in tongues older than man, and the river sung its gentle hymn, untainted by the echoes of execution orders or the wretched laughter of courtiers. Here, the earth breathed. Here, the wind carried no decree of death, only the scent of pine, and of fresh soil and open sky. Here, there was only life. Stadius had long abandoned the vanity of time. Days passed without a name, seasons shifted in the quiet rhythm of eternity. He and Sainte de Morte lived as exiles, as saints, and as ghosts who had escaped their own funeral. He had built a home with his own hands, rough, uneven, nothing compared to the grandeur of Versailles, but real. A place that did not belong to the king, a place that did not belong to death, a place that belonged only to love. It was morning, a holy, aching, golden morning, and Stadius, half dreaming, half prayerful, lifted his eyes. There, on the crest of a hill, where the earth met the heavens in a quiet communion, she stood, Sainte de Morte. But not the Sainte de Morte he had first met, not the child of shadows, not the wraith with eyes cast downward, hidden beneath rags and exile, not the executioner of kings, not the saint of death. No, this was something new. She stood barefoot, the dawn wind weaving through her hair, pulling at the linen dress she had sewn from stolen fabric. She was not veiled. She was not cloaked in darkness. The sun kissed her brow. The sky wrapped itself around her like a celestial mantle. She was luminous. She was as the golden hush of the morning, the breath between night and day. She was the light that had long been kept from itself, and now poured upon the earth like honey decor from the gods. Her hair caught fire in the sun's embrace. Her eyes, no longer hidden, no longer cast downward in shame, lifted to the heavens, and in them the fractals bloomed. No longer shattered, no longer broken, no longer a mirror of sorrow, but of light. Stadius could hardly breathe. This was not a woman bound by death. This was not a woman resurrected. This was a woman resurrected. He sat beneath an old tree, his tattered journal in his lap. Ink smudged in his fingers, but his pen lay still. For what words could be written in the presence of something so sublime? He had spent his life writing poetry. He had spent years painting the sky with metaphors, shaping the world in sonnets, bleeding ink into existence. But this was beyond poetry. This was the thing poets die trying to describe. This was the thing Dante saw and wept. This was the thing Bernini carved into marble, trembling in its shadow. And this was the thing that tore open Kierkegaard's soul and left him undone. And this was the thing the angels beheld in silent reverence. Stadius's hand shook, and as he lifted his pen, he did not write a sonnet. He did not compose an aria. He simply wrote in the final page of his book, beneath all the longing and exile and madness, a single line. My love is no longer saint of death. She is the saint of life. A breeze stirred the pages. Sainte de Morte turned. Their eyes met across the hill. For a moment the world stood still. Then she smiled. And Stadius, poet of the court, exile of Versailles, fool of love and madman of devotion, knew that he had never written anything through her. Thank you guys so much for listening, and God bless you.